I want to begin with two stories. The first goes like this. There was a great Hasidic Yid, a great Chassid, who was traveling to his Rebbe for an occasion, Shabbos, Yom Tov, I don't know what it was. He was a real Chassid who would visit his Rebbe frequently, and he was used to coming to his Rebbe and being greeted very warmly and being embraced and included within the inner circle and so forth. On this particular occasion, en route to his Rebbe, he was traveling through the wilderness, through some forests, through some back roads, and he encountered a house, a home. And he entered into the home, and it was a Jewish home, and he was greeted very, very warmly. And he entered into his home, and he asked for food, and he asked for lodging, which of course was provided. And while there, the people in the home began to discuss Torah with him. And they shared some thoughts with him, and each time they would share a thought, they would ask him what he thought of it. And he would say, sounds very good to me, wonderful, great thought, great. And he was constantly being inspired with original thoughts and being asked his opinion. He was complimenting the thoughts. When he arrived at his Rebbe's home, his Rebbe's shtetl, the Rebbe completely ignored him. Just totally ignored him. Wouldn't look at him, wouldn't acknowledge him, certainly wouldn't greet him and talk to him. He was very taken aback. And what bothered him most was that he wasn't even being told why. What crime had he committed? What sin, what transgression was he guilty of that he was being given the cold shoulder, the silent treatment? And he went to his fellow Hasidim and said, I don't know what my crime is, but the Rebbe he's not even angry at me, he's just behaving as though I weren't here. So a group of Hasidim approached the Rebbe and they said to the Rebbe, we have our good friend, he's here, and he doesn't even know what he's done wrong. So the Rebbe says to them that on his way here he stopped off in a home, and unbeknownst to him, that home was a negative force, was an evil force. And these people whom he saw, who were discussing matters of Torah, were actually evil. And when he praised the Torah they were teaching, he connected himself to them. And consequently, I want nothing to do with him. So they came back to this chassid, and they said to this chassid that the Rebbe said, and on the way here you encountered, in Yiddish they call them nit gute, no good, negative forces, and consequently you're being ignored. He said, but how can I, first of all, I didn't know. Second of all, how can I correct it? So he went to the Hasidim, went back to the Rebbe, and at first the Rebbe didn't want to give him advice, but they persevered, and he said, you have to go back to that home and mock them. Whatever they say, you have to belittle them. Any idea, any theory, any posit that they offer, you have to reject and refute and scoff and make fun of and so forth. So this chassid went back down the same road, and he encountered the same people, and he came into the same home, but this time he was very, very antagonistic. And he began to call them fools and idiots, and they offered him thoughts, and he kept on discrediting their thoughts and making fun of them and putting them down. And the people were getting very angry and very disappointed. Last time you were here, you were so complimentary, and now you're being so angry and so contrary. And he understood that his relationship with his Rebbe depends on him continuing to put these people down. So he completely ignored any efforts they were making at reaching out to him, and he made fun of them, put them down, until finally they decided they're going to hurt him. They're going to physically hurt him. And they circled around him and said, okay, we're going to hurt you. And he told them, I go in the power of my Rebbe, my holy master. And I'm not afraid of you. So these negative forces, these nishguta, said to him, who is your Rebbe? And he told them his Rebbe's name, the name of his tzaddik, his holy master. And they said to him, we are going to look through our ledgers, our books. If we find any evidence that we have any kind of hold on your Rebbe, which means to say your Rebbe has done anything not entirely ideal, which gives us some control over him, we'll be able to hurt you. Otherwise, you're free. So they checked whatever kinds of ledgers or reservoirs of information that they had, and they said to them, your Rebbe's name never appears in our books. You're free to leave. And he left. This is the story. Now I want to tell you a second story. The second story involves the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe had 3 sons and 3 daughters. The second of his daughters was Rebbe Leah. The most famous of his daughters was Rebbe Leah. She was the mother of the Tzemach Tzedek, who was destined to be the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, and she actually gave her life up so the Alter Rebbe should live. This is one of those famous Hasidic stories. She married a man by the name of Reb Shalom Shachner ben Reb Noach, a Jew by the name of Shalom Shachner. Tzemach Tzedek's father's name was Reb Shalom Shachner, and his father's name was Reb Noach. And there is a story that is told by Hasidim that explained why the Alter Rebbe took him for an Edom, for a son-in-law. This young man, Reb Shalom Shachner, Tzemach Tzedek's father, was clearly a great Torah scholar and a very pious Jew and all the rest. But the fact that the Alter Rebbe had selected him as his son-in-law meant something extraordinary. And Hasidim would tell the following tale, the following story, to explain why the Alter Rebbe favored him so much. And this was the story. The Shalom Shachner's father's name was Reb Noach. By the way, the family name was Altshuler. That's what we find in some sources. Reb Noach. In other words, the Tzemach Tzedek's paternal grandfather was a Jew by the name of Reb Noach. And the story was as follows. This Reb Noach was a very big chassid, an incredibly great chassid. And his Rebbe was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Harodoker, the Mendel of Vitebsk. He was the senior Hasidic leader in Russia. The Hasidic movement started in the Ukraine, in Poland as it's called, Galicia, and it slowly made its way north to Lithuania, to Russia, to Lithuania. And there were not that many, but there were a handful of great Hasidic Rebbes that lived in Lithuania and Russia. The senior Hasidic Rebbe there in Russia was a Jew by the name of Reb Mendele of Vitebsk. He originally lived in Harodok, then later he moved to Vitebsk. He spent the last decade or so of his life living in Yisrael, in the city of Tveria, in Tiberias, where he's buried. He's a very, very holy man. He's a very big tzaddik. And he, in fact, was the Rebbe of the Alter Rebbe, whose Tanya we're learning. The Alter Rebbe had 3 Rebbes, had 3 masters. The first was the Holy Maggid of Mezrich, who was a direct disciple of the Holy Baal Shem Tov. The second was his son, Rebbe Avram the Angel, Rebbe Avram the Malach. And the third was this Rebbe Mendel of Vitebsk, Rebbe Mendel of Harodok. And I think it was a Friday night. And they were sitting at the tish, they were sitting with their Rebbe at the table. And what happened was, this Reb Noach, the grandfather of Tzemach Tzedek, the Mendel of Vitebsk, the Mendel of Shalom Shachner's father, had journeyed to Israel by ship. And en route, along the way, the ship never capsized. The ships collapsed at sea. And all of the passengers were drowned. This Reb Noach, the Shalom Shachner's father, Tzemach Tzedek's grandfather, was dying. And he somehow saw a vision of his judgment. And his judgment was, the heavenly courts declared, that he should either go to Gehenna, to purgatory for 1/2 hour, or he should be reborn. I think that's the story. I'm not sure, but I think that's the story. Either he should go for half an hour to Gehenna, or he should be reborn. So Shalom Shachner, but Reb Noach, told the heavenly court, I lived my entire life by the instruction of my Rebbe. I never did anything without his counsel. This question I want to ask my Rebbe as well. So the heavenly court said, okay, let's examine if that's in fact true, whether every single decision in your life you did according to the instructions of your Rebbe. And they examined, they checked, and it was determined that in fact this chassid, this Reb Noach, the Tzemach Tzedek's grandfather, never ever did anything meaningful in his life without consulting his Rebbe, and they told him he was right. And the Mendel of Vitebsk was sitting by the Tish on Friday night, and he said, my disciple Reb Noach is being judged. And he said to the heavenly court that in all of his life he never did any serious decision without consulting me. And therefore he is consulting me. And my advice to him is that he should choose the half an hour of Gehenna, half an hour of purgatory, rather than come back down into this world again. The Alter Rebbe was sitting by the Tish with all the Hasidim, and the Mendele Vitebsker related this, and he said his verdict, and the Hasidim heard his voice. They heard him say, "Ay Rebbe." He was in another place, and they heard his voice, "Ay Rebbe." The Alter Rebbe was there, and he was so moved that a person, after he passes away, should have such a connection to his tzaddik, that physically the disciples heard his voice in his room as he was, so to speak, interacting with his Rebbe for the last time. He says, "I want his children to be in my family." This is why he chose Reb Shalom Shachner to marry his daughter, and the father of the third Lubavitcher of the Tzemach. Why am I telling you these two stories? And I can tell you 100 more like this. I'm telling you these two stories because what these stories reveal is the nature of the connection between Hasidim and a Rebbe. There are all types of Hasidim and all types of Rebbes. Some relationships are very, very platonic. There are Hasidim who visit Rebbe A, Rebbe B, Rebbe C. I had a neighbor who told my father that he has different Rebbes for different things. For health, he goes to so-and-so. For panos, he goes to so-and-so. For he had a list of Rebbes. He had experts in various fields. But serious Hasidim, deep Hasidim, were connected to the Rebbe very, very deeply. And as I've told you so many times over the course of our learning, the reason was because what a Rebbe does for his Hasidim is not take care of his material ills and help him with his medical issues or with his financial issues or with his other kinds of concerns. A Rebbe was, as the word implies, a spiritual guide, somebody who teaches you how to connect to God Almighty. A real Hasidim, who had real relationships with their Rebbe, had an incredible loyalty, an incredible sense of dependency, connection, love for their Rebbe, because it was through this holy master that they had a path, a way of serving Hashem, and allowed them to connect to Hakodesh Baruch Hu, allowed them to connect to God Almighty. These two stories, in different ways, I suppose, reveal the unique connection that existed between Hasidim and a Rebbe. There's a Chabad tradition, which apparently isn't even true, but it's such a wonderful thought that I'll share it even though it's not true, which seems a bit inconsistent, that there was a great chassid of the Alter Rebbe named Michal Lapotzker. Lapotzker is a city. This chassid of Michal Lapotzker used to go to the Alter Rebbe. When the Alter Rebbe passed away, his son succeeded him. When his son passed away, his son-in-law, the grandson of the Alter Rebbe, succeeded him. The Michal Lapotzker never went to the second Lubavitcher Rebbe and to the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, only to the first. And the Rabbeim used to send him, during the light, the Rabbeim would send him young men to teach them how to be Hasidim, even though he himself never traveled to the second or the third Rebbe. And when people would ask him why he didn't go to the second Rebbe, to the third Rebbe, this is how the story goes, he would say, "I went to my Rebbe, to the Alter Rebbe, and I gave him my neshama, I gave him my yechida. Now, if I go to another Rebbe, I have nothing to give, I've given it away. To go to a Rebbe and not give, I cannot. To go to a Rebbe and not give of myself on the deepest levels, I can't, and that's why he wouldn't go." We are learning this evening Iggeres Hakodesh Chav Zayin, the 27th letter in the Tanya. This and the next letter, which of course with the help and grace of God we'll do next week, talk about Histalkus. There are two letters in Tanya where the Alter Rebbe is consoling people for the loss of a great tzaddik. Next week's letter is a letter written to the Holy Rebbe Levi Yitzchak Abaditchev, who was a dear friend of the Alter Rebbe's, whose son had unfortunately passed away, obviously relatively young, and the Alter Rebbe was consoling him. We'll do next week's letter next week. This letter is really very powerful. It's very powerful because it was a letter that the Alter Rebbe wrote to Hasidim on the passing away of their Rebbe, who was actually, in fact, the Rebbe of the Alter Rebbe himself. As I mentioned to you before, The Alter Rebbe said he had 3 teachers in succession, not at the same time, one after another. The first was the Holy Maggid, the second was his son, Ram the Angel, and the third was this Rebbe Menachem Vitebsk. The Alter Rebbe had a very, very strong connection to this man, very deep, powerful connection to this person. And he loved him very much. He loved him very much because he felt that he needed counsel, he needed direction in Avodas Hashem, and that through this Rebbe of his, Reb Mendel of Vitebsk, he got that counsel. I just recently saw something very interesting. A book was published in the last 6 months, a biography of a chassid by the name of Zalman Garari. He was a wealthy Jew, and he collected Hasidic artifacts. I don't know where he found it, but he found a snuff box, a gold snuff box, which the Alter Rebbe had given as a gift to this Rebbe of his, Reb Mendel Vitebsk, and engraved in the snuff box is the name of his Rebbe, Rebbe Menachem Mendel, a gift to Menachem Mendel. On the back of it, it's a gift from your disciple, Shnei Zalman ben Rivka. This is such a precious artifact. Where he picked it up, I don't know, but he has 2 snuff boxes. Gold, they're 200 years old. Reb Mendel of Vitebsk passed away in 1788. Okay, it's well over 200 years old. He must have paid a pretty penny for it. I don't know where he found it, but there's actually pictures of it. And you can see that the Alter Rebbe had somebody engrave in the snuff box a dedication. Alter Rebbe was a real person, was a deep person. And his relationships with his Rabbeim were based on deep concerns. His Rebbe taught him how to serve Hashem, which is the ultimate connection that 2 people can have. In other words, the greatest thing you can get from another human being is a path. We all understand, we're looking for a path. Alter Rebbe got from his Rebbe a path, and consequently he loved him very, very much. And the long version of the story is that when the Mendel Vitebsk made the decision to go to Israel, the Alter Rebbe joined him. He sold his house, sold his belongings, and traveled with his Rebbe. The Russian Hasidim, the Hasidim of Reisen, were up in arms. They said, how could you do this? You make us into Hasidim and you run off to save yourself in the Holy Land. Hasidim in Russia were in the eye of the storm. They were dealing with the objections of the Misnagdim more than any other group of Hasidim. They needed leadership. And here the Alter Rebbe is running off to Israel. And the Alter Rebbe said to them, I'm 32 years old, and I'm still in need of a teacher. And according to Jewish law, a person is allowed to prioritize himself. I'm allowed to put myself first. I still need a teacher. He sold his house, sold his belongings, and left. And en route, as they were traveling, the pressure mounted. The Hasidim put more and more pressure onto the Alter Rebbe and also onto the Mendel of Vitebsk. They said to the Mendel of Vitebsk, you cannot let him go, you have to send him back. There's a lot of details to the story. At a certain point, a decision was made, and Alter Rebbe was made to turn around and go back to Russia, and he did. And he relocated to the city of Lozhne, where he was a Rebbe for many, many years. And the Mendel of Vitebsk promised him that he would correspond with him, that he would continue being his Rebbe through correspondence. And that's how they communicated. They were travelers between Europe and Israel back and forth, mostly to bring money. The Israeli Jews had no source of income, they had to be supported from overseas. The Alter Rebbe raised money to support his Rebbe and the Hasidim who had made the trip to the Holy Land. And these emissaries who would carry the money would also bring communication. And the Alter Rebbe remained in touch with his Holy Rebbe in the Holy Land. In fact, in the introduction to the Tanya, he mentions the fact that the Tanya is based in part on correspondence that he had with his Holy Rebbes in the Holy Land. When the Mendel of Vitebsk passed away, I think he passed away after Pesach, Tov Kuf Memches, 1788. The Alter Rebbe no longer had a Rebbe. And he wrote a letter of consolation to these Hasidim. And this letter of consolation is a unique kind of a letter of consolation, because it's a letter of consolation that deals specifically with the connection that exists between a tzaddik and his followers. In other words, this letter has a principle. And the principle is that 2 people can be connected. People can have peripheral connections, people can have deep connections, people can have an incredibly deep connection. The relationship between a Rebbe and Hasidim, assuming that it's a relationship that's based on real things. And real things, as I explained to you before, means that the Rebbe gives counsel and direction to his Hasidim. And really a path, a way of life, is a very deep connection. The depth of this connection expresses itself in, amongst other things, pushed in a love. A love, you appreciate somebody. A real Chassid loves his Rebbe because he appreciates, he values what his Rebbe gives him. It's not just a casual relationship. It's not just, I gave my connection to you, you gave my connection to me. This is like a relationship that determines a person's path in life. So the Alter Rebbe says, Hasidim, who had a relationship with their Rebbe and loved their Rebbe, do not lose that relationship when their Rebbe physically passes. And the degree of connection and the measure of love that they had with their Rebbe during his physical lifetime determines the degree of connection and measure of love that continues after the tzaddik passes away. When the words of the Alter Rebbe, Kol HaKorev Koidim LeBracha, the closer a chassid was to his Rebbe during the Rebbe's physical lifetime, the more connected a chassid will be to his Rebbe posthumously, even after the Rebbe has passed away. And like I said to you earlier, there are innumerable stories. There are so many stories we know of Hasidim that demonstrated this idea that there was a very, very special connection between a chassid and a Rebbe, and that this connection continued even afterwards. I'll share something a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, powerful. We know, as a matter of fact, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rebbe Rasha, passed away, and he took a minyan with him. Within a year of his passing, before and after, 10 Hasidim passed away. And I believe that the same can be said of the previous Rebbe, and I believe the same can be said of the Rebbe. You'll see that there were certain people who died who had very special connections with the Rebbe in a short time surrounding the Gimel Tammuz. But one cute little story. There was a chassid named Yankov Landau, who was meant to live into his 90s. But he was a young man when his Rebbe, the Rashab, passed away. And he went to the Oyhel, went to the resting place of his Rebbe, and he wrote a note. He says, I want to die and be buried within 50 cubits of the Rebbe. I want to die and be buried near my Rebbe. I don't want to live. I don't think he was married at the time. The previous Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab's son, went to the gravesite of his father, and he came back, and he called Rabbi Yankov Landau, and he says, Yankov, the Tat hat gesagt, nicht schreiben keine Narrigkeiten. My father told me to tell you to stop writing stupid things. The man passed away. The Rebbe Rashab passed away in 1920. He passed away in 1984. Gives you an idea. And this letter revolves around a Zohar and several other Maimonic Chazal that support and that argue this case. That this is the kind that a person who had a connection to a tzaddik in his physical lifetime, this connection continues afterwards. The beginning of it is as follows. When a person dies, what is the expression that is used to denote the passing of a person? There are many expressions. A person is nifted, a person is nistaled, all kinds of, a person is mace. One of the expressions used in Chazal, used in rabbinic writings, that describe the death of a person is shavak chaim l'chol chai. It's Aramaic. Shavak means he has left the life of all the living. That's the literal translation. Shavak chaim, he has left life l'chol chai, to all the living. But if you translate the words literally, you'll get the exact opposite translation. Shavak means he left over, not he left. Chaim, life, l'chol, to all the living. Not he left the land of the living, but he left over life to all the living. So the Alter Rebbe said, I heard from my Rabbi that when a person dies, this is true of everybody, but especially at tzaddik, Shavak Chaim L'chol Chaim means he doesn't go away from this world and finished. It's like as if he never existed. He leaves some of his life with the people with whom he lived. This is true of every person. Our loved ones who are deceased rejoice in our joy, and they mourn our failures and our sadnesses and so forth and so on. I'm going to get carried away here, but I know several wonderful stories, but one of them is, it was a very prominent rabbi who passed away, whose wife died, and they had no children. He was saying Kaddish for her, and the Rebbe wanted him to remarry, and he was very taken aback. He was almost insulted by the suggestion, because he was still saying Kaddish. It was so short after she died, and he was trying to reason with the Rebbe that the Rebbe should get over this idea of him remarrying. So he said to the Rebbe, I want my wife to be happy. And the Rebbe said to him, if you'll be happy, she'll be happy. And another story that I heard was a woman died. A woman lost her husband. And had a really, really special relationship. And she couldn't get over his loss. She just was mourning for more than a year. She was just absolutely broken until he came to her in a dream and said, please stop crying, I have no rest. There's a connection. You had a connection to a person in a physical lifetime, that connection continues. But by tzaddikim, it's a very, very powerful connection. And by tzaddikim, the connection is on very powerful areas or planes or issues, because the aspects by which a tzaddik is connected to the ordinary person is obviously very, very special, very, very deep. And there are a number of aspects to this. So the essence of this letter is that when a tzaddik passes away, he leaves some of his life with all of his followers. There's a zohar, a very, very famous zohar that says, tzaddik spater, when a tzaddik passes away, and by when a tzaddik passes away, the word that we use is nistalik, which means the neshama has risen up to a higher level, but not that it's departed. Ishtakach bahai alma yatem evachayoi. The tzaddik who passes away is actually found more in this world than the tzaddik was during his physical lifetime. Now, how does that make sense? A person passes away, the guf is no longer here. How is it possible that the tzaddik be found more in this world than it was during his physical lifetime? And the Alter Rebbe explains it. A tzaddik has limitations. His limitations are his body. His limitations are time. And his limitations are space. He can only be in one place at a time. He can only do one thing at a time. Time ticks away at its own heartless pace. And it's inflexible. Cannot negotiate with time. When a tzaddik does not have a body, the limitations that the body imposes, limitations of time and space and containment are removed. And as a result, in a certain respect, it is spiritually easier to access the spirit, the energy of that tzaddik, than it is to access the energy of the spirit of that tzaddik during the tzaddik's physical lifetime. And there are a few points that the Alter Rebbe is going to make. But before I share these points with you, I want to give you an introduction. I want to give you something to contemplate. And I say this to you not only in light of this letter, but I'm saying this to you even in light of the idea of people visiting the Ohel. When you go visit the Tzaddik's resting place. I want to share this idea with you. You meet people all the time. When we meet people, especially meet strange people, there are a number of relationships that are transpiring, a number of things that are happening. There are conscious things happening and there are subconscious things happening. You meet another human being, you shake their hand, you look into their eyes, you share words, you share feelings, you share ideas. These are various levels of communication. And of course, on these various levels of communication, you determine the level of connection you are going to permit yourself to have with that person. You decide, this is a good person, I can have a relationship with this person is not such a good person, I prefer not to have a relationship, or would like to have this kind of relationship with this person, and another kind of relationship, and so forth. But there are other things that go on as well, and we all know this. There is an aura or a halo about every one of us. A person walks into a room and you become suddenly uncomfortable because their energy is for you a negative energy. Another person walks into a room and you're drawn to them. Some people don't have to say a word. They walk into a room and people turn around. And not because necessarily tall and distinguished, but because there's something about them that spiritually calls people. It's a subliminal thing. It's a subconscious thing. Every human being has an energy. And this energy is shared. When a person meets a tzaddik, the language that we employ in our tradition is that it's a meeting of every level of the soul. Nefesh b'nefesh, ruach b'ruach, neshama b'neshama, chaya b'chaya, yechida b'yechida. It doesn't matter what these words mean. But the soul has many layers. Some of these layers are conscious. Some of these layers we're in charge of. We're in charge of the things we do. We are to some degree in charge, or at least aware of how we feel. We are in charge in how we reason. But there are subconscious layers. There are dimensions of our souls that we're not consciously aware of. What we call, for lack of words, our subconscious and our essence. When a person meets a person especially when a person meets a tzaddik, all of these relationships are transpiring. Some of them we are aware of, and some of them we're not aware of, because we're not that sensitive. A tzaddik, a righteous person, a holy person who's very sensitive, taps into this relationship on all of these different levels. So if you walk into the room of a tzaddik and you engage in a conversation, there's much more transpiring than you are consciously aware of. You're communicating, you're speaking words, you're expressing feelings, you're discussing actions. But there are things transpiring here that you have no sense of, but the tzaddik does. When you go to a resting place of a tzaddik, or if you're meeting a tzaddik and you're not exchanging words, so the conscious levels of meeting, which you and I can relate to, are not transpiring. But the subliminal, the spiritual connections are transpiring. The tzaddik is a sensitive soul. And the sensitivity of that soul exists on all the various different layers. So when you go to the oyel, for example, we believe that something spiritual, something real is transpiring. We wouldn't go otherwise. But from the perspective of the tzaddik, this is a very, very real experience. And that's why it's useful, that's why it's purposeful on so many levels to involve yourself when the tzaddik, even if you don't have the possibility of exchanging words and discussing ideas, because there are all kinds of higher levels of connection that are transpiring. This is why you go to the oyel. Go to the oyel, the neshama connects with the neshama. Now, what do you take away from your experience at the oyel? It depends how sensitive you are, I suppose. Depends how much preparation you make, I suppose. But something real happens, something spiritually real transpires in this meeting. Getting back to this letter, Alter Rebbe says, the tzaddik passes away, but by no means is he gone. And he divides it into a number of different aspects. Number one, there's the body of the tzaddik. Tzaddik passes away, the body of the tzaddik is in a particular place, the resting place of the tzaddik. According to Kabbalah, and I'm no Kabbalist, but according to Kabbalah, where the body is, the nefesh is. The nefesh is the lowest level of the soul. The Rebbe would often tell people that where the body is, the Iggeres, the highest level of the soul is also. The body of a tzaddik continues to retain the life that the tzaddik had during its physical lifetime on a certain level. To be sure, according to Torah, every person's soul has a connection to the resting place, which is why visiting even relatives has the purpose simply beyond nostalgia and planting flowers. There's a spiritual connection that takes place. But by tzaddik, it's especially true. And one of the symptoms of this, of course, is that we know from Sfarim, we know it also from case history, some facts, that a tzaddik's guf does not deteriorate. The body of a holy person does not deteriorate. There are many examples of this. We know as a matter of fact that tzaddikim's guf is preserved. Why? Because a tzaddik is a holy person. And the holiness of a tzaddik is such that it makes the body godly. Not just there's a godly body and a godly soul in an ordinary body, but that the body itself has a godliness. And consequently, the body becomes a real thing. A real thing means a permanent thing. Which is why the guf of a tzaddik is not, doesn't deteriorate. Deterioration has to do with klipa, with inexactitude, with deficiencies. And a tzaddik, because the tzaddik's identity, his person, his life, was lived in a holy and a godly way, the body is preserved. And connected to the body of the tzaddik is the level of the neshama called nefesh. And when a person visits the resting place of a tzaddik, there can be a connection between a nefesh and a nefesh. That's number one. Number two, there's a level of the neshama called ruach. And for lack of words, the ruach is what you and I would call the halo, the energy field. In other words, nefesh would be the level of the soul which is within the body. Ruach would be the level of the soul which is the energy field of a person. You live your life, you interact with people. The meetings that you have with people are more than simply the communications and the physical interactions. There's, whenever two people meet, there's an energy, and this energy is either good or bad or immaterial. A human being's ruach is, so to speak, his energy field. Says the Alter Rebbe, the ruach of a tzaddik remains in this world. And he says it's true both for good as well as for bad. And he describes it this way. Each one of us has around us an energy field. This energy field involves a very, very positive force or a positive force, and it also involves not such a positive force. He gives examples, the Alter Rebbe does, that in the Chumash we read that Yitzchak, Isaac, wanted to bless his son Esav, as you all know the story, and he sent him out into the field to hunt, and of course Rebecca arranged that Yaakov Avinu should come first and bring his father the feast, his father should give him the blessings. So Jacob walks into Yitzchak, and Yitzchak feels that the spirit of Gan Eden is entered his room, the spirit of paradise. Yaakov Avinu brought with him a very positive energy. And of course Yitzchak was very happy to give him the brachas. When Yaakov left, and Esav arrived, it says in the Rashi, based on the Psukim, Yitzchak began to tremble, because when Yaakov walked into the room, Esav walked into the room, he brought with him the Avid of Gehenna, brought with him the most negative force. In other words, the halo around the person registers who that person is. Our energy field reflects who we are. And a good person has a very positive energy about themselves. And a not such a good person has not such a favorable energy about themselves. And an evil person has an evil energy field. Says the Alter Rebbe, when the person's physical body dies, their ruach, their spirit, the energy fields that they create during their lifetime doesn't completely depart. And it's no longer connected to a body. And because it's no longer connected to a body, it doesn't have the same constraints, the same limitations that it had during the physical life of a person. Which means, during the life of a tzaddik, if you wanted a connection to a tzaddik, you had to travel to a particular place, you had to meet him at a particular time, and his time was limited and his possibilities were limited. When a person had a connection to a tzaddik during the physical lifetime of that tzaddik, that connection continues, but those limitations no longer exist. So in a way, it is easier to connect to a tzaddik after the tzaddik passes away than it was to connect to the tzaddik during the physical lifetime of the tzaddik, because the ruach, so to speak, the energy field, the spiritual force that the tzaddik created during his physical lifetime continues to exist in this world and is no longer constrained by a body, which makes it in a way easier for people to access. So there's two sides to this. There's two sides to this, and the two sides to this, I think, are very, very real. One side to this, the tzaddik has no body. You cannot see him. You can't connect to him physically. And when you cannot connect to a person physically and talk to that person and, so to speak, touch that person, there is a lack of reality to that person. And because there's a lack of reality to that person, it becomes very difficult to have meaningful connections. And when I say meaningful connections, I mean a connection which is going to affect how we live our lives practically. When you have a connection to a tzaddik, and you know him, and you see him, and you touch him, and you're touched by him, there's a certain responsibility, there's a certain binding quality to your connection to that person. On the other hand, when you meet, when there's no physical presence, you don't have that obvious, that plain, that simple bond that takes place when you're meeting another human being, which makes it very difficult to connect to such a person. The flip side of that coin, however, is that if a person already has a connection to a tzaddik, in whatever way, either because he met the tzaddik during the tzaddik's physical lifetime, or because he studied the tzaddik's writings and teachings, and that these teachings talk to him, in other words, connected to him in such a way that it made the purpose of this tzaddik, the teachings of this tzaddik, the life of this tzaddik real, you can have a connection to such a person. Now, the Rebbe argues that people who have a connection to, he's speaking specifically of people who physically knew the tzaddik. He says, if you knew the tzaddik during his physical lifetime, and you loved that tzaddik, and of course, the love that you have for that tzaddik is a reflection of the nature of the connection you have with that tzaddik. And the connection you have with that tzaddik is not that he helped you live a comfortable material life. The connection to that tzaddik was he gave you a path through which you were able to develop a relationship with the Eibishter, with God Almighty. That availability, that access continues to exist. If I can say it in other words, when you're trying to connect to a tzaddik that you never physically knew or that you can't physically see anymore, The difficulty is taking him seriously, or taking it seriously, taking the idea seriously. And you have to understand, taking the tzaddik seriously is really as much about taking yourself seriously, and your responsibility seriously, and your purpose seriously, as it is about taking the tzaddik seriously. But if a person can get over that hurdle and realize that there are real people, and real people teach real things, and that I had a connection to a real person, and I can continue having a connection to that real person, that reality continues to be real. This is called the ruach, the spirit of the tzaddik. And the spirit of the tzaddik, the Alter Rebbe argues, continues to exist in this world. Then the Rebbe says, but the neshama of the tzaddik goes away from this world. The neshama of the tzaddik leaves this world and goes to a higher realm, goes to a higher plane, and in a way loses its connection to this world. However, even the neshama of the tzaddik, which departs from this world and goes over to another world, also has some indirect connection to us. And here's how. You influence a person. You affect a person in a positive way. You inspire a person to do good things. That person does good things. So, by way of metaphor, speaking allegorically, you have planted seeds in that person. The good deeds that person does are in effect, or indirectly, the fruits of your labor. The person you influences somebody else. And the person that person influences somebody else. So in effect, when we do good deeds, these good deeds have ripples. And oftentimes the ripples, the good that we do, has ripples that continue forever. Every good deed begots more good deeds, which begets more good deeds, which begets more good deeds. And what does this mean, that the neshama should ascend into a higher world? It means a lot of things. But amongst the things that it means is that a neshama does good deeds. When a person passes away, they can no longer do any more good deeds. So when a person passes away and they can no longer do any more good deeds, all of the good deeds that they did are accumulated and raised up. When it comes to Yartzeit again, are there more good deeds for this neshama in this world that will allow the neshama to ascend to a higher level of Gan Eden? And of course the answer is, of course. Because they planted so many seeds. They did so many good deeds that have ripples. Every person we influence during our lifetime in a favorable way, who will in turn influence other people in a favorable way. So when it comes to the Yartzeit of a person, or the Yartzeit of a tzaddik, all the additional good deeds done in this world that are affected by their lifetime raise up and they give the neshama an aliyah. This is called planting seeds, or gidul gidul, the offspring of the offspring. So the Alter Rebbe in this letter makes the following additional comment. He says that when a person passes away, so the obvious idea is that the good deeds they did in this world begot additional good deeds. And all of these good deeds are raised up to where the tzaddik is, where the neshama is in the higher world, and the neshama has an aliyah. But there is a concept that up there on high, the good deeds that a person does, the good deeds that a person accumulates, are also planted. In other words, the heavens are also described as a field or as a garden. And the good deeds that a person has done during their lifetime, which belong to that soul, forever are planted in the higher worlds and also produce offspring, seeds. And the offspring and the seeds that they produce is a very indirect, a very obscure but real connection to this world. In other words, when people die, people pass away, the higher they go, spiritually speaking, the less connection they have to this world. They lose their connection to this world. However, because the ascent, the growth that neshama has done on the higher realms had to do with the fact that it did mitzvahs in this world, though the neshama is distanced from this world, some of the good that the neshama accumulates in the higher worlds has an indirect influence on this world. And the indirect influence on this world touches people in a very, very, very indirect kind of a way. The way the Alter Rebbe describes it in this letter is, he says, oftentimes people will be moved to do tshuva, or be moved to improve themselves in some other ways. And it's because of this obscure effect, this indirect effect, that a tzaddik may have on their lives, although the tzaddik is completely in another world. And this becomes the third type of connection that you can have to a tzaddik. The first kind of a connection you have to a tzaddik has to do with nefesh. The nefesh has to do with the body of the tzaddik. The second kind of connection has to do with what's called the ruach, the halo, the spirit of the tzaddik. A person lives in this world, he leaves his energy here. If he was a good person, he leaves a favorable energy field. If he was not such a good person, he leaves not such a good energy field, and you can connect to that. And the third is the neshama. The neshama goes away from this world and has very little to do with this world. But the good that the neshama accumulates in the higher world has an indirect, has a very remote but real influence on us. He brings, Alter Rebbe mentions that it says in Zohar that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. Moshe Rabbeinu was a very, very bright star, incredibly bright star. Moshe Rabbeinu passes away, he loses his connection to this world. But from the gigantic neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu, hundreds of thousands of tiny little stars, tiny little sparks, so to speak, radiate in a very, very obscure way and have an influence on this world. So the Alter Rebbe is writing this letter. And he's writing this letter to Hasidim, whose Rebbe has passed away. They lost their Rebbe. Losing a Rebbe is a very, very powerful experience. It's a very powerful experience because the Rebbes you can't replace. You don't just get a new one, you understand? The reason that Rebbe you can't replace, because replacing a Rebbe is almost the same thing as replacing yourself. Because the connection between a chassid and a Rebbe is a very, very deep, very, very real and serious connection. Because the connection between a chassid and a Rebbe is about the most serious things in the life of the chassid. Not just about the most serious things in the life of a Rebbe. Because as I explained to you repeatedly, a chassid gets a path in life from his Rebbe. You know, there was a great chassid who was a bit of a fanatic. And somebody was trying to get on his nerves. He was so dedicated, he was so loyal to his Rebbe that he would say that as far as he was concerned, his Rebbe was the greatest tzaddik who ever lived. So some fellow asks him, who is a greater tzaddik, your Rebbe or Moshe Rabbeinu? And of course, that seems like a no-brainer. So he answered in kind. He says, if I had no Rebbe, I wouldn't know anything about Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, a Rebbe is so special to a chassid because what he gives them is so real and so deep. He teaches them how to serve the Eibishter. Or in the language of this letter, the Alter Rebbe says, what's a tzaddik? A tzaddik is not about food, clothing, and shelter like regular people. A tzaddik life is amunah, avavir, faith, love, and fear. And people connect to a tzaddik because through the tzaddik they too have faith in God and love of God and fear of God. So when a chassid loses his Rebbe in a very, very serious way, his identity as a human being has been severely challenged. So the Alter Rebbe says to Hasidim, if you were connected to a tzaddik during his lifetime, that connection continues. And although the physical presence isn't there, you can't touch that physical person. But if you had that physical connection, and you took from that physical connection something spiritually real, you can continue getting from that tzaddik something spiritual real, and in certain respects, in fact, you can get something even more than you could have gotten during the physical lifetime of the tzaddik. And our Rebbe would always say that although in this letter, the Alter Rebbe says that those who knew the tzaddik and loved the tzaddik during his physical lifetime have this connection already established so that they can maintain that connection, or that the connection can grow, while people who didn't know the tzaddik will have a much greater difficulty. Says the Rebbe, it's possible to get to know a tzaddik after a tzaddik passes away. Because if you learn his teachings, and more importantly, learn how he teaches how to live, he can become your Rebbe even though you physically never met him. And when a person develops this kind of relationship with a tzaddik, so this kind of spiritual possibility, this kind of spiritual connection can possibly exist. So the Alter Rebbe is saying to Hasidim, as long as you follow the directions of your Rebbe, and you live life as he inspired you and how he taught you to live it, to you, your Rebbe still lives. This is the ultimate consolation. As long as Hasidim go in the ways of their Rebbe, to them, their Rebbe still lives. So you shouldn't feel like you've lost your Rebbe, you physically lost your Rebbe. But spiritually, you can determine that you're still connected to your tzaddik if you continue following the ways that the tzaddik taught. And the lesson is obvious. I think about this often. And I'll finish with this. This is one of the things that's been on my mind lately a lot. There are a number of stories that have a similar theme. When the Alter Rebbe was arrested, Alter Rebbe was taken to jail. Right? Alter Rebbe was taken to jail because he was a criminal, he was a troublemaker. What was his crime? His crime was that he was teaching people how to serve God, and somebody didn't like it, so they made up some kind of libel. Alter Rebbe went to jail. Sure. And of course, in the Hasidic tradition, we always explained that the Alter Rebbe's going to jail was more a spiritual thing than it was a physical thing and so on. So one of the famous stories that's told about the Alter Rebbe's arrest was that when they came to arrest him, he knew. He had a heads up. He knew beforehand. And the way the story is told is that they came to town during Sukkot. The people who came to arrest him, the government agents who came to arrest him, came during Sukkot. And they had no idea who they came to arrest. They just had a name and an address. They had no concept of how powerful a person. And they discovered that this rabbi they came to arrest had hundreds of followers that come to town to spend Yom Tov with him. And they understood that to take this rabbi away, it's going to be at least unpleasant. So they consulted with the local police chief who knew who the Alter Rebbe was. He says, listen to me, wait till after the holiday. Bad idea to take him now. So they waited till after Sukkot. And the day after Sukkot, he was arrested. So the Alter Rebbe knew that he had come to take him. So one of the many stories that Hasidim tell is that the Alter Rebbe actually escaped. He disappeared. And the reason he did is because he wanted to contemplate his options. He wanted to consider his choices. And he met Reb Shmuel Munkes, a very famous chassid who was a jester. He was a comic, but he was really, in fact, a big chassid and a big tzaddik. And of course the story was Shmuel Munkes comes to him in the middle of the night and knocks on the home where he was staying. And the Alter Rebbe says, who's there? He says, Shmuel. So the Alter Rebbe says to him, you have to come in the middle of the night, can't come during the day. So Shmuel Munkes says to the Alter Rebbe, I didn't know that in your world there was such a thing as a night. And he says, Shmuel, they came to arrest me. And Shmuel Munkes says, well, I think you should allow yourself to be taken. Shmuel Munkes was the Alter Rebbe consulted him on the arrest. Alter Rebbe says, but it's dangerous. In other words, he was asking him a halachic question. According to Jewish law, you're not allowed to put yourself in a place of danger. I could run away, they'll never find me. Shmuel Munkes says, I think you should allow yourself to be arrested. Alter Rebbe says, but you're not allowed to put yourself in a dangerous place situation. So of course, the long version of the story goes that Shmuel Munkes says, I'm going to tell you a story. He tells him a story about the Mendel Hakodesh, the very Rebbe we were just reading about tonight. That he had a coachman who used to take him from place to place. And he was once in a very, very big rush. And he told the coachman to go very, very quickly. And they were going down this hill, and the horses were running very, very quickly. And instead of staying on the road, at the foot of the hill, there was a big home, a big mansion. And instead of turning, they went straight through the front gate of this home, and they smashed the front window, and out came this prominent man with a revolver, and he wanted to shoot, who just, ran over my fence and smashed through my front window, and he points his revolver at the coachman, and the coachman points it at, he says, not me, look at the rabbi in the back, it's his fault. He told me to run, so the owner of this home turns his revolver on the Mendel of Vitebsk, and he pulls the trigger, and the bullets don't come out of the gun. So when this person realizes that all of a sudden his gun has malfunctioned, he decided that maybe this is not the kind of rabbi he wants to shoot, so they left. And after they leave, the Mendel Docker says to the coachman, I don't understand you. He pulls out a revolver, points it at you, so you point at me? I mean, what? What nonsense is that? He says, Rebbe, I would never have gone this quickly, I only went this quickly because of you. And he says, the only reason I went as quickly as you because you're a Rebbe. He said, well, if you're a real Rebbe, no bullet will hurt you. And if you're not a real Rebbe, then you deserve a bullet. Who gave you the right to deprive so many people of the pleasures of the material world? This is what this chassid, this wagon driver said to the middle. So Shmuel Munkes said to Alter Rebbe, I think you should go to jail and deal with whatever the consequence of it will be, because If you're a Rebbe, no bullet can hurt you, which makes it not dangerous. If you're not a Rebbe, you're worthy of a bullet. Who gave you the right to deprive so many thousands of people of the pleasures of this world? This is the story. I've been thinking about this a lot. I really have been thinking about this a lot. In relationship with our Rebbe, with the Rebbe. How would you translate that idea, depriving people of the pleasures of this world, in modern Lubavitch? I can't exactly say that Lubavitch Chassidim today don't eat, bread with butter or have coffee with sugar. It's not exactly the kind of deprivation that we experience. But there's something else, I think. This is a personal opinion. The Rebbe had such high expectations that he got every person to be more than they would have been otherwise, in a very real way. In a very, very real way, a very serious way, at great personal cost. In other words, every chassid who does the Rebbe's work is a person that would have also done good things had they not had this kind of a personal relationship with the Rebbe. But because of the Rebbe, they were a giant. Because of the Rebbe, they did much more than they would have ever been able to do. And it wasn't only because the Rebbe gave them the koyches to it, it's because the Rebbe expected it. And I think this is the modern equivalent of this idea, when you are close to a tzaddik, the demand, when you're near the fire, you get burnt. This is an undeniable fact. People who were close to the Rebbe couldn't help but be affected by his power. And it wasn't always comfortable. The Rebbe's presence was so strong that he demanded and he commanded so much by his presence that you had to be more of a human being than you would have been otherwise. You had to be more of a chassid, more of a shliach, more of an activist than you would have been otherwise. So the spirit of this letter is that inspiration, that additional motivation. In other words, the more person you were because of your relationship with the Rebbe continues. If you continue to appreciate the kind of connection he had to the Rebbe during his physical lifetime.
And he along with the supposed family and exact and the moxie.
The point is, he was a regular person. Okay? Now, a regular person is judged at an ordinary standard. Right? How can you hold a person responsible for acknowledging a person who tells you a good idea, who happens to be a corrupt person if you don't know it? What was the crime? He went to this place, he met some people, they told him some thoughts, they asked him, what do you think of him? Sounds good to me. How was he to know that these were evil spirits, this was a bad place? And the answer is he wasn't. But he had a connection to a tzaddik. Because he had a connection to a tzaddik, there was a higher expectation of him because of a connection that he had with the tzaddik. And that higher connection he had with the tzaddik made expected of him more, but also empowered him more. So when he goes back and he discredits them, he doesn't have the power to discredit these forces. He's a small little person. It's his connection to his tzaddik. So they say, if we have some hold on this tzaddik, then we have a hold on you. If we have no hold on this tzaddik, we have no hold on you. I'm telling stories. Let me tell you another story. The same Shmuel Munkes that I mentioned a minute before. He was really a very special man. He was a comic. He went around being silly and making people laugh. But he was literally a tzaddik. He was a holy man whose pretense, his shtel, his external persona was that of a simple person. And this is one of the many Hasidic stories that they tell about him. In fact, when the story is told, they always finish the story by saying that year the Alter Rebbe was arrested, as if there's a connection between this episode and the Alter Rebbe's arrest. And here's the story. He lived in Polotsk. Polotsk is a city near Brooklyn. It's a place in Eastern Europe. Polotsk is actually a pretty big city, if I'm not mistaken. And near where he lived, there were two clergy, Christian clergy, who were machashv. They had some kind of powers of black magic. They had some kind of special powers. And they used to hang around with the Jews and talk to them. And their entire purpose was somehow to get a spiritual hold on the Jewish people. And but they were afraid of Shmuel Munkus. He was a big chassid and so on. And it happened once that they met Rabbi Shmuel Munkus in a motel with some people, and they were introduced to one another. And they said to Shmuel Munkus, these two priests, these two, whatever they were, they're mechashim, they're magicians. So Shmuel Munkus, in perfectly in spirit with his personality, said, well, I'm a magician too. She said, oh yeah? So let's make a contest. Sure. So there's two of these magicians on one side, and the Shmuel Munkus, the magician on the other side. And of course, the Shmuel Munkus is not taking himself very seriously. He told us this is a big joke. And these two guys say to him, okay, we're two, you're one. You get to go first. And to do some kind of a performance. So Shmuel Munkus, no, you do whatever you want and I'll react to it. She said, fine, we're going to take a glass of water. We're going to say some kind of incantations. And you'll drink it. He said, sure, no problem. But after I drink the water, you have to each drink a cup of spirit, of alcohol, of vodka that I'm going to give you. So they take this cup of water and they start saying all these Latin words. And apparently they had some kind of spiritual powers because the water becomes putrid. It starts to stink and it changes colors. And by the time they're finished, it looks and it smells like death. But it's magic, which means in Jewish law it's not real. It's just a achizas einayim. It's a perception. And they give Shmuel Munkus this glass of water and they say, drink it. He picks up the glass, downs it. And he's supposed to blow up now. He's supposed to be, and nothing happens. So they realize, hey, that this rabbi, this Jewish comedian has got a power. He said, okay, now you have to drink a glass of vodka. And he pours them each a glass of vodka and they refuse to drink it. The people who witnessed this challenge made them drink it, and within days they were both dead. Shine. Comes Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi Shmuel Munkus goes to the Alter Rebbe. He spends Rosh Hashanah with the Alter Rebbe, then he leaves. Yom Kippur, he comes back to the Alter Rebbe. But this time he can't come into the city of Lozhne. As he's trying to enter the city, there are these ravens, these black birds that are attacking him and not letting him come into the city. The Alter Rebbe goes out of his house, calls 3 Hasidim, and says, Shmuel is walking to me, but he can't come to me. Go get him. Go greet him. He sent his son, the Mittler Rebbe, and 2 very prominent Hasidim to go and greet the Shmuel Munkus. So they go out of the town, and they greet him, and they're bringing him into the town. When Shmuel Munkus sees them, he gets very, very upset. I don't know why, but he says, fools, why did you come? In other words, somehow he understood that it was a bad idea that the Alter Rebbe should assist him. Anyway, he comes into town. He doesn't daven with Alter Rebbe that Yom Kippur, and that was the year the Alter Rebbe was arrested. And the way the story goes is the Alter Rebbe said to him, had I not said Amen on your bracha, you would have been finished. When he said that, Shahakal Niyah B'Dvarim, did I not say Amen on your bracha? There's a connection between a tzaddik and a chassid. The more of a chassid one is, the deeper that connection is. And on the one hand, it obligates the chassid. And on the other hand, it empowers the chassid. And that's why I told these stories.